have two panelists with us, Ambassador Sujan Chinoy and Dr. Adrian Hack from KAS India office. And both, I think, perhaps can engage with two sets of issues that Ambassador Puri raised. Ambassador Chinoy, if we can start with you. I think we heard a lot about UN reforms and UN reform agenda. And of course, one very pertinent issue about financial structural reforms. Perhaps if you want to talk about that, you have done a lot of work on that area and you have looked at it very carefully. As to what reforms are we looking at from an Indian perspective, which are priority areas for reforms, and where do you think the bottlenecks lie in terms of moving forward?
Thank you for inviting me. And Ambassador Lakshmi Puri has covered a vast gamut of issues. But for me, fundamentally, the takeaway is that multilateralism is fractured. It's not yet completely irrelevant. In other words, it must not just be reinvigorated, but also reformed fundamentally. And I think the international community must judge multilateral systems in terms of their ability to deliver, their ability to resolve the number of challenges that we face today in an era of polycrisis. There I would say the scorecard is rather poor because the UN Security Council as well as the UNGA are racked by dissent and differences. And although one can take the safe view that for the past 77 years, the UN system has held peace more broadly, I do not think it has truly delivered. It has not fully delivered on human rights, it's not fully delivered on peace and security, and it's certainly not fully delivered on what you call economic growth and development. The League of Nations also failed, as you know, to keep the peace in the interwar years, and it sank without a trace in 1946. Now, when you look at the League of Nations as a reference point, what is interesting for me is that all members of the League of Nations, whether they were permanent or non-permanent, actually had equal veto rights, and yet it sank without a trace. This is because those that exercised veto rights then were also extremely unhappy sharing that power with the others, and one by one, whether it was Japan, whether it was Italy, whether it was Germany, or eventually the Soviet Union, they walked out of the League of Nations. The key point here is that the UN Security Council has not been reformed for a very long time. Certainly not since 1965, when there was a cosmetic change in terms of increasing the total number of non-permanent members from 6 to 10. Now, it's from the Indian point of view, it's interesting to note that in 1945, one particular Asian country had a free pass, that is the Republic of China, poor, agrarian, large population, and it was made to sit in the Security Council just to add a little bit of color, and it certainly didn't have nuclear weapons then. In fact, nuclear weapons or the possession of nuclear weapons was not a criterion. Only one country had demonstrated possession and use in 1945. The others came on later. Today, when you look at it from the Indian perspective, whether in terms of its economic clout, its population, its contribution to global structures, multilateralism, the initiatives that we have taken, ranging from yoga to the International Solar Alliance or the Coalition on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, for that matter, what we are trying to do in terms of resilient infrastructure for island countries, India is well placed to be right there at the top of the table. And I think from our perspective, therefore, we would urge the global community to do more in terms of the intergovernmental negotiations, which are really not achieving much since 2007. We must look closely at veto power, which has been greatly abused by the permanent members. On the financial institutions, if I may add a word or two, I think from my general understanding, the IMF SDR quota system has, right since the inception, been weighted heavily in favor of the developed nations. So if you look at the SDRs of 952 billion US dollars, well, nearly 1 trillion, it's only 1% of global GDP. So it shows that there isn't adequate financing there. Secondly, when you look at the breakup, 426 billion US dollars is really the SDR element. The rest of it is new arrangements to borrow, bilateral borrowing arrangements, which are again discretionary in the hands of the developed countries. So to start with, the SDR structure hasn't seen much of a reform. A bit of tinkering that was referred to in terms of the additional voting rights in 2007 and 8, possibly the bailout of $659 billion that Ambassador referred to, but there hasn't been a restructuring in terms of the relative weightage of respective economies in the global economy and their corresponding SDR rights at the IMF. For the World Bank also, I think it has to compete today with other financial and developmental systems. I see three. There is one, the US-led Bretton Woods system, which has not delivered at a time where about 75 countries are in deep distress. The second one is actually the ADB structure led by Japan, which has tried its best and is working closely with many. And the third structure that has emerged is one that is led by China, which is preserving the existing system because it benefits from the existing system, but also creating parallel systems like the AIIB and the BRICS New Development Bank, etc. For me, the irony here is that these are working together and yet not working together. The United States and Japan are nowhere to be seen in the China-led systems, but their closest allies, like the United Kingdom, Germany, Australia, are inherent members of the AIIB, and India is a founding member of both AIIB and the new development bank of the BRICS. It's a very complex situation. What I would see the positioning of India is that in this world in which there are too many binary choices between this group or that group or this ideology or that, India must offer that third choice. Whether it is in infrastructure, whether it is in solar, whether it is in connectivity, whether it is with regard to island nations, it is India that can also offer ethics, values, and truly try and implement this whole idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The crisis is common to all geographies. I've generally tried to summarize that as the 6 T's. The T of trade, the T of technology, the T of territory, the T of terrorism, the T of tenets as in narratives and competing ideological groups, and the last one is the T of trust or the utter lack of it. This is common, whether it is the Indo-Pacific, whether it is Ukraine and the European theatre, whether it is elsewhere. So we should have more of multilateralism, but this can only be done if there are adequate structures that deliver. And they must deliver for the betterment of the global community, not to preserve the exceptionalism inherent in the existing global system. I think the G20 for India provides that moment when we can bring everybody onto a common platform. There are no vetoes in this group yet. A very large part of the global GDP, trade or population is involved, and maybe reason with people to see that this is an opportunity for low-hanging fruit to be delivered, to try and overcome some of their contradictions elsewhere. And I think India can give that leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
From what Mr. Adrian Hack just said, I want to emphasize one point here. The G20 also runs the risk of having a divide between the G7 and the rest. And my urging to the G7 would be, do not try to usurp or replicate the powers of the UN Security Council or the divisions therein into the G7. Because the UN Security Council is divided, utterly, hopelessly divided, with the Russians and the Chinese tending to take one line and the United States, UK and France taking another, the G7, in my view, is gradually usurping that power to create the kind of consensus that we can't find in the UN Security Council. If they were to bring that attitude and exceptionalism and pre-decision making into the G20, it would be at the cost of the rest. So that is something that I would mention. And as far as veto is concerned, I don't know if you are interested in this, but history tells us that when the veto was finally being discussed at the Yalta Conference in 1945, the American representative took the view that it's either the veto system for a privileged few or no charter. You can forget it. You can go back and tell your governments that there was no charter. And of course the rest of the world was bamboozled into accepting this unequal system. So we have to be a little careful here in terms of bringing in a G7 approach that is inflexible, for it has decided on several things as G7 and thereafter is unable to accommodate the rest. I think that's where the G7 can actually stumble and force the G20 to take a hit as well.
Thank you. I know we are running out of time, but since this event is for you, I will give you 2 questions. So anyone, please come forward and ask a question. 2 questions. One gentleman, one lady. I think that would be fair. Can you have the mic, please? Oh, you can come here, yeah. If you're quick.
This is Vishal Kumar from second year political science. So we are talking about multilateralism. So there are so many contestations we are discussing. And if framing in a better way, we can frame by Robert Cohen, who taught multilateralism in nowadays as a contested multilateralism. So somewhere from the Westphalian system idea of equality and sovereignty, we are diminishing the idea of globalization by these contestations. So can we say that multilateralism is now a damage to globalization and the globalized world?
Okay. Sorry? Multilateralism.
Contested multilateralism.
Yeah. So can we take all 3 questions together and maybe we can ask the 3 panelists to respond. Yes, please.
I would first like to thank Hindu College and ORF for giving me this opportunity. As my question is, my name is Harshvardhan and I'm from Dayal Singh College. My question is, as we have been speaking of reformed multilateral institutions and from the G20 platform itself, an emphasis on multilateralism from India's end, is it contradictory with our policies of developing hypersonic missiles or developing weapon-grade plutonium, and even the Atmanirbharta in defense expenditure? If multilateralism is the call of the day, so do we really need to focus on our defense expenditures when we do have other domains like health and education, which need a huge investment, especially in this era of Amrit Kal when we are at the edge of materializing our demographic dividend?
Thank you, sir, giving me the opportunity. I am Anju Sharma from Pol Science Department, Kirodimal College itself. My question is for Lakshmi ma'am. Namaste ma'am. If this is a Yugantar moment for India, then why is India lacking the diplomatic policies in terms of bilateral relations with China, when China is aggressively dominating in the Indo-Pacific region, along with renaming the places of Arunachal Pradesh and which is all in all threat to our very soul of India's integrity. Thank you, ma'am.
So can we have very, very brief responses from the three panelists? Ma'am, will you go first?
Well, I just want to briefly refer to the issue of contested multilateralism. I think what is happening is that there is a global multilateral order which is riven right now. You know, you had the end of the Cold War in 1990, and then after that it was a unipolar world, and then now we have a recrudescence of the East-West divide and Cold War 2.0. That is impacting multilateralism, and that's going to continue to impact multilateralism as we discussed. As far as the relationship to globalization is concerned, globalization is a different concept. As you will know, I would ask you to look it up. Basically, it's about economic globalization, and of course, it has the winners and losers of globalization. And of course, now the West, which was a winner in the earlier part, now sees Chinese-led hyper-globalization as actually not so beneficial anymore. So, you know, there is that contestation happening even in globalization, but that's a separate process. On China, I would ask our expert here to respond rather than taking on that context. And also on maybe the whole issue of defense, I think there are, you know, the external environment is a very important determinant of how we allocate resources for development. And I think you have to take into account as much the defense threats, territorial integrity, as you have to take into account education and health related priorities. And I think there has been a progressive enhancement of our investment in both the health and education areas, particularly post-COVID on health. And but of course, we have this, you yourself refer to the kind of threats we face on both our you know, on a two-front threat. So we have to keep modernizing and building our military strength.
So I'll say that contentious multilateralism has existed for a very long time. If we look at the current structure since 1945, it's been the order of the day through the decades since then. The only difference is that during the Cold War, despite there being contentious multilateralism, the world was divided into two blocks that were not necessarily connected at the economic level. There was no real globalization of the economy, and that enabled contentious multilateralism to actually come up with a modus vivendi that enabled work to get done, although there were differences during the Cold War between the two camps. Today it's quite different because not only are the two main adversaries intrinsically interconnected at the economic level, the United States and China, for instance, but the rest of us, including Global South, is interconnected with the both of them. The second point is that globalization is the genie that you cannot put back into the bottle. Some have gamed it, some have used it better than others, but there are a lot of countries that have not benefited from the globalization as we know it today. The gaming has to be prevented. In other words, for instance, market access, the definition of a market economy. China, despite being in the WTO for long since 2001, at the end of the 15-year period, was not recognized as a market economy in 2016 for very good reasons. So globalization has to be a level playing field. It cannot be a structure in which some can gain things more than others, create dependencies, debt trap diplomacy, and so on and so forth. Third point very quickly is that the world today is unable to agree to a proper definition of rules-based international order. And the point here is that these rules, as many argue, were made by some, were made by few countries in a different era also. This may actually put the most unlike partners on the same side sometimes. For instance, even India would believe that there are aspects of this rules-based international order in which India had nothing to do with the making of those rules and regulations. At the extreme level, you will see that China, which is part of the existing privilege system, is also saying the same thing, that rules-based international order, but in the context of the Indo-Pacific, the Chinese would say, we didn't make those rules, we didn't contribute to that. So anyhow, as far as India is concerned, it's not a question of guns versus butter here. There has never been total peace, though there hasn't been a world war since 1945. But there's always been war and pestilence and disasters and unsettled territorial issues, which I mentioned as one of the 6 Ts. India has to keep its powder dry. For us, Atmanirbhar Bharat in defense does not mean that we go in for an autarkic policy of total self-sufficiency. For me, it means self-reliance, in which there is ample scope for India to move up the value chain by actually working with others in the globalized economy, in which defense is a very important part, to see how we can actually become more competitive and how we can actually bring in some of the key supply chains into India, which will have a spin-off benefit and transformational benefit for the rest of industry and economy. Let's stop there.
Thank you. All that's left for me is to thank my 3 panelists, and thank you all for being very patient with this panel. And hopefully we'll move on seamlessly now to the next panel. Thank you.